Circles, Peter, the nicest number.
There's more room over here for you, or the back there. If it's uncomfortable standing, there's more room over here in front.
I wonder if there's any kind of ventilation. There's no, do those windows open back there, I wonder, Al? No.
It is hot.
If only we had a little more cool air blowing in here, I guess we would probably talk a lot more and more clearly and answer your questions much more clearly, or say things more clearly. But smoky air has a way of getting into your throat and clogging things up.
Penguin shit, Peter. More talk, beautiful talk has been through smoking and drinking.
Well, the penguins that you love so much would never think of smoking a cigarette. They just love to sit on rocks and
no, those poor dummies
bare
are
their
stuck with
breasts
ice.
to the sun.
Those poor penguins are stuck with ice.
I wouldn't think of eating a
Can you free that
a
at all?
silly little can of beer.
What's so silly about it? Falstaff, Shakespearean beer.
What did he say? I didn't hear that.
Peter, I'm gonna steal your car. That's gonna blow your head. You love your car, right? I'm gonna rip it off. You can't drive out around no more. I'll get the car. I'll go away with it. They won't call the police on me, right? Great. That's the way to get a car.
Am I taking your chair here?
Always take from your friends, because they never call the cops. If you take from a stranger, they'll lock you up.
Thank you, I guess.
We got a chair?
Peter's got to open it up. He's gotta open it up.
In 1958, President Eisenhower addressed the nation concerning the crises at that time in the Middle East. American Marines were being sent to Lebanon. Because I had registered for the draft automatically in those days, as everybody else did, the threat of war was taken very personally and seriously by me and my family. So we gathered around our 12-inch television set to hear the president. We sat in a semicircle, my father on an easy chair, on the couch with my young brother, my sister, my mother, and on the floor lay our dog, Missy. The announcer said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States." We almost stood at attention. The president then got to the business at hand, and very grim business it was. But not long into the president's speech, I found that I began nodding off to sleep. And after several minutes, recovered with a sense of embarrassment for not paying attention. As I looked around in the room, however, I noticed that my father also had fallen asleep, that my sister was asleep, my brother was asleep, and on the floor lay Missy, our dog, also asleep. That was America in the 1950s. Everyone plunk in front of their television sets, nodding off to sleep, with no sense of moral crises or spiritual urgency. No doubt this was the effects of the Eisenhower drug. Old middle-of-the-road Ike and old middle-of-the-road America. And it was out of this cultural test pattern of a country that Jack Kerouac emerged as a writer. He rejected that America whose primary occupation is television hypnosis. Kerouac saw more to life than the black and white television tiles that glaze electronic living rooms. He preferred the art of conversation over the silent process of watching. America was homogenizing its thoughts, but Jack Kerouac was about to nurture a subculture. And perhaps subculture is not as good a word as ultra culture. Kerouac portrayed a world that provided alternatives for those who wished not to be addicted permanently to the Eisenhower drug. The altar culture was symbolized by the rucksack. It was verbalized in the oral tradition of poetry and spontaneous prosody. It was deified by Neil Cassidy and personified in the image of the Dharma Bum. In contrast was another America, symbolized by split-level ranch-type houses, verbalized by the droning voice of Arthur Godfrey, personified by the politics of Joe McCarthy, and deified in the image of the almighty buck. Kerouac writes in Big Sur, well, you know, they build cardboard houses and put people in them, and the people are cardboard, and the magician makes the dead body twitch, and they bring water to the moon, and the moon has a strange ear. Kerouac's literature preserves not the conversations of cardboard people, but the conversations of barnstorming musicians, railroad men, hobos, migrant farm workers, and truck drivers, the fellahin nomads of America, as opposed to what my friends call the cold, cautious, efficient, hypocritical, unimaginative, and therefore likely to remain so, middle American. And why not? After all, who wants to listen to a silent majority? When asked what would have happened if he never left Lowell, Jack Kerouac replied, I would have worked in a mill all my life. But then again, there was the river, which he saw so vividly in Dr. Sachs. He writes, to me, the Merrimack River was a mighty nap of continental importance, the continent of New England. By moonlight night, I see the mighty Merrimack foaming in 1,000 white husses upon the tragic plains below. Recall that Thoreau lived in nearby Concord and traveled much in Concord. He made Walden Pond the center of his universe, and he expanded his mind and awareness in ever-widening concentric circles, the center of which was his very soul. But Walden Pond, in the mid-19th century, was not what America was becoming. Immigrants were rushing into manufacturing towns in New England, which the Indian had long since lost and abandoned. Thoreau warned of the crippling effects of mass production and the assembly line long before they became the American way of death, long before the mass of men were to live those lives of quiet desperation. Now, let your mind flow gently down the Concord River of mid-19th century America to where it joins the mad rushing waters of the mighty Merrimack in 20th century Lowell. Then you will understand, if you understand rivers at all, why Jack Kerouac went on the road. The rivers are the metaphor. Thoreau was on the Concord, which is calm and peaceful as its name denotes. But Kerouac was on the Merrimack. That's it. Jack Kerouac on the river Merrimack. Make no mistake about it. The Merrimack River was part of Jack Kerouac's soul. He became the rushing surge of its flow, and his words are now part of the Earth's sea. Jack Kerouac's movement was fast-flowing and linear, away from the placid calm of Concord, away from the dull town of Lowell. In Big Sur, he says, the world being just what it is, moving and passing through, actually all right in the long run, and nothing to complain about. So he did not remain in Lowell. He could not remain in Lowell, whose true history is exploitation of its people. But Jack, in another sense, never left Lowell either. He wrote, all this comes back to me, then goes again, comes back again, then goes again, and I don't care. It still belongs to me. And now Jack Kerouac belongs to us. So let his words fill the empty rooms of America. Let his literary monologues replace the vacuum in our heads. Let his energy light fires in our souls. And let his work salvage our feelings of compassion. Jack Kerouac makes words tap dance. The people he wrote about were models of liberation and mobility for the poodle-cut and petticoat generation of the 1950s. Jack Kennedy wore no hat during his inauguration, but Jack Kerouac was the wind blowing through his hair. No prose writer in post-World War II America is as prolific or prophetic as Jack Kerouac. Without him, we would not have heard that voice of Alter America. Without him, there would have been no spirit of the 60s. So I thank Jack Kerouac for the literature that he gives us, and as Richard Nixon begins his second reign, I think back to 1968 when he was elected, and I said to myself, a new era is yawning. I thought back I thought back to when Eisenhower put us to sleep. And now we are paralyzed by a derivative of the Eisenhower drug, Richard Nixon. We remain passive while Vietnam villages, this is inevitable I suppose, while Vietnam villages are bombarded by order of the president. We have a ho-hum attitude toward moral and political questions while the executive branch of government grows more powerful than ever. We think of Nixon as a conservative when in fact he is a radical. Yet we awake not from our slumber. It seems to me that the tragedy of Vietnam could be summarized as an attempt on the part of the United States to destroy a revolutionary movement by destroying its culture. Without cultural identity, without a sense of historical continuity, revolution is impossible, but capitalistic enterprise can flourish. But as long as America has people to write, it will never lose its sense of historical continuity. The 1950s and 60s were chronicled by Jack Kerouac. And today, subcultural people are subterranean. They flee the cities. They retreat to the pastoral worlds of green Vermont. But thanks to Jack Kerouac, their culture and identity is preserved. If ever it happened that our libraries were closed or books taken down from bookshelves, you could be sure that someday an old rucksack would appear on a highway in America, and tucked away in that rucksack would be a paper-bound book by Jack Kerouac, and that means something while America sleeps. Thank you. Before Mr. Jarvis reads his paper, Professor Jarvis reads his paper, I would like to introduce the panel members. First of all, this entire Jack Kerouac tribute, or whatever you wish to call it, is a result of the sponsoring of the Salem State College Arts Festival and the Cultural Series. Mr. Steve Salvo and Mr. Brian Joyce have been most cooperative in putting this together. We all owe them a debt of gratitude and thanks. We will have, go ahead. I also want to thank Carol Morrow, who's the program director, for her assistance too. Carol? We will go until 4 o'clock, and at that time there'll be hors d'oeuvres will be served in that A and B lounge, and we will take questions from the audience if you wish to submit them. I will try to moderate this, but we'll also allow it to happen spontaneously the way it should. On the far left is Peter Orlovsky, who is a friend and poet. He was portrayed in several of Kerouac's novels. Next to him is petite street urchin Gregory Corso. Next to him is Stanley Twardowitz from Northport, New York. Stanley was a close friend of Jack's, and when Jack was living out in Long Island, he was close with Stanley. Stan has paintings and sketches and haikus and some interesting tapes, and he's going to lend a perspective on that time in Jack's life. Then and in the center, Allen Ginsberg, who probably needs no introduction, great poet. Former king of the May in Czechoslovakia.
They kicked him out of Czechoslovakia.
I know.
100,000 kids voted in King of May. You know why they kicked him out?
Why?
Because he dug a young boy. Said, how beautiful thou art. And the father got upset. They ripped off his notebooks, and his notebooks he talked about his beauties of his own sexual dreams, and they said, this is terrible.
All right, we'll get to that, Greg. John Cleland Holmes, another one of the early beat writers whose novel Go was published in 1950, and, right? 1952. His book, Nothing More to Declare, has a very good portrayal of both Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and he just recently did a piece for Playboy magazine on the funeral at Lowell. And next to him is Aaron Latham, who is an editor at New York Magazine. He has written a book on F. Scott Fitzgerald, and suddenly he finds himself working on, not so suddenly actually, finding himself working on a biography on Jack Kerouac. As you know, a biography came out last month by Ann Charters. Aaron is working with the cooperation of Sterling Lord, Jack Kerouac's agent, and the family, and so he may have some interesting new thoughts on the biography. And last but by no and last but by no means least, Professor Charles Jarvis from Lowell Tech is and a friend of Jack. Well, Jack was in Lowell in those later years. What was it, from about 64 to 66? Yeah, 62, Tony? Okay. Charles Jarvis is going to read a short essay that he wrote in remembrance of Jack. It's called Jack Kerouac, Angel Goof. After that, we'll take questions, and anybody can react on the panel to what happens after that. So I give you Professor Charles Jarvis.
Did he say short essay?
The hooks.
Watch out for the hooks. Yeah, can you hear me? No. Well, I first heard of Jack Kerouac back in 1938. We were both attending Lowell High School. Now, he was a football star. I was just going there. And his name was all over the sports pages. I didn't know him too well then. I knew who Jack was. He was an athlete. Although we had mutual friends. People like Sam Sampras, who appears in his books, Alexander Panos in The Town and the City, Sabi Savakis in Vanity of Doulouas. Other people like Jimmy O'Day, who was Timmy Clancy in Maggie Cassidy. Other people like John Kumanzelis, who was John Kazarakis in Maggie Cassidy. Anyway, I really got to know Jack about 20 years later. When Kerouac graduated from Lowell High, he disappeared from the consciousness of his native city until he reemerged in 1950 as the author of his first book, The Town and the City. The town, of course, was Lowell, and the city was New York City. But the reviews were enthusiastic, fine reviews. But the public response was something less than bland. Lowell's reaction was somewhere in the middle, though the Lowell Sun did serialize the book. But then, once more, Kerouac submerged, and he did not surface again until 1957, when his second book, On the Road, fell on the ears of his fellow townsmen and, of course, the rest of the country with the force of a sonic boom. I asked him once what the essential difference was between his first book, The Town and the City, and his second book. Well, he came forth with a smile, a kind of a smile that, to me at any rate, always reflected a broad plane of kindliness, but with a tiny stream of slyness at times. Anyway, in answer to my question, he said, the difference was the money, man, the money. He said, The Town and the City was written with violins. On the Road was written with bongo drums. Well, a few years went by. In the summer of 1962, after years of absence, Kerouac visited Lowell. In a letter to a friend in Lowell earlier that year, he wrote, I do long to revisit Lowell, but also I'm a bit scared. Every time I cross the Moody Street Bridge, now the Textile Bridge, every time I cross the bridge, I feel a weight of guilt. But at the same time, Lowell fills me with joy. As I told Charlie Sampras, I revisited in 1954 and hiked around the city 25 miles, recognized all my old chums, but they didn't see me. I was a ghost. And yet now, in 1962, visiting Lowell, he was famous. And the word got around that he was in town. But if Jack expected the key to the city, he was wrong. I found him in a local bar on Market Street, and the few that came to see him left with a feeling of amusement, and possibly some of them with a slight sense of disgust. When I saw him, I was startled. I hadn't seen him for years. The once dark-maned, clear-eyed Endymion youth had become somewhat soggy. His face was booze-lined. He was bombed, and he was raucous. He wore a pair of fatigue pants, a plaid shirt, three-quarter shoes, and a hunter's cap. Reminded me sort of the kind of a hat that Admiral Bull Halsey wore on the bridge of his World War II ship. What I didn't know then was that all but 4 or 5 of my remaining contacts with Jack Kerouac would be under these conditions. That is, he in a state of alcoholic euphoria, you might say, and I, mostly sober, gathering in every syllable that streamed from his brain. But I must say that the booze never diminished his giant mind, and his physical senses rivaled those of Edgar Allan Poe's Roderick Usher. In the bar that night, I was introduced to Kerouac as an English professor. I said, "You know, I've long admired your work, Mr. Kerouac." He had been trying to sing with Andy Williams' version of Moon River coming out of the jukebox. And when he suddenly saw me, he stopped and he said, "Are you really a professor?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He bowed Arabic style, salam. When he came up, he said, "Is it true that professors have the highest rate of masturbation in the professional ranks?" Well, I smiled, probably nervously. I said, "I don't know, Jack. Has such a survey been made yet?" Now, he laughed, and I sat down, and for the next 3 hours, I managed to utter about 40 words. And Kerouac released about 40,000 of them. He sang, he made speeches, he roiled around the room, the bar room. Occasionally, he would quote poetry. And then he'd look mischievously over at me, presumably for approbation. So I approved. Before I left him that night, I tried to solicit from him a promise to appear in a local radio show which I and a friend of mine, James T. Curtis, had been conducting for a number of years in Lowell. It was a semi-monthly show on WCAP with a rather pretentious title of Dialogues in Great Books. It was a literary discussion program, we thought. When I put the question to Kerouac to come on our program, he looked at me suspiciously, and I felt that he not only doubted the existence of the program, but he also doubted my claim of being a professor, at least a teacher. I added that we would tape the show, but that we'd have to go to the studio to do it. So he said, "I'm leaving in a couple of days. I ain't got time for such pedantic displays." So I said, "Well, listen, Jack, tomorrow will be fine. Any hour of the day you prefer." He said, "You're not kidding me, are you?" He said, "You know what? You look like a member of the mafia to me." I said, "Look, Jack, I'm not even Italian. My heritage," I said, "is Greek, and you grew up with some Greeks here in Lowell. That alone should reassure you." So he chuckled a sodomian joke about Greeks. And he said, "Okay, you gray-haired lecher, I'll be up at your one-lung radio station tomorrow at 3. And he was. He came. My radio partner, Jim Curtis, and I were disbelievingly overjoyed. He came up there with Stella Sampras, his wife-to-be. And we sat around a table and got ready to tape the program. The sound engineer was off to one side. And just when we were ready to begin, Jack whipped out a pint of booze, took a quick gulp, placed the bottle before him, took a deep breath and said, "Okay, let's start throwing the crap around." Well, I've heard many literary interviews in my day, and I assumed that ours would follow the general format of, philosophical exchange. So I began with an introductory comment intended to focus the idea of a milestone having been reached in our program. Well, I never finished the comment because Kerouac seized on the word milestone. And he said, I am Louis Milestone. And then he went on, he said, milestone, gallstone, death. Well, I didn't know it then, but the pattern for the program had been set. And in the course of the next half hour, Kerouac came at us like a thunderstorm. Booming, wild revelations, and yet in between the gusts and whippings, he would enter passages of quietude, leaving us becalmed and awkwardly striving to keep the program going. He reached the peaks of rapture, crashed down to deep chasms of ecstatic melancholia. And as I think on it now, it was a minuscule version of the human emotional spectrum. Curtis and I had difficulty focusing questions. So rapid and capricious was Kerouac's span of attention. I've heard the tape many times. I've come to the conclusion that in that half hour, Jack Kerouac was the epitome of Dean Moriarty, chief character in On the Road, with all of the fits, starts, stops, and all the forces that impel Moriarty to try to corner it, to burn, burn, burn. And yet, despite the Kerouacian, Kerouac preferred the word Kerouacian. Despite the Kerouacian storm that howled around us and its constant nipping at the bottle, we did manage to shout out a few questions. We got a few answers. First of all, he was very indignant when he was asked by Jim Curtis about the extent to which he revised his work. Once God moves that hand, he shouted, and you go back and revise, it's a sin. Every time I turn on the faucet in the toilet, no, wait a minute, he said, and the water comes from the river, my thought doesn't have to be improved because I got it from heaven, just like you got yours. Now, as to his approach to writing, he said, I write in vast 18,000 words a night bursts for about a week, and the book is done. I'd use a 16-foot strip of teletype paper and the typewriter, and I blast away, single space, saying, I'm going to tell you what happened, because it's all true stories, and all I do is change the names. Kerouac compared his method to that of Honoré de Balzac and his prose to Marcel Proust. He said, I've read Proust's Remembrance of Things Past and decided to do just like he did, but fast. To further punctuate his disdain of revision, he said that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet in one night. And then, scooping up his bottle and belting one down, he said that Shakespeare died of drinking in Avon. In the middle of a question that Jim Curtis asked him about Big Sur, Kerouac boomed out that Proust and Joyce are the greatest writers of the 20th century. And he lamented that Joyce died before he was able to write down the sounds of the sea, but that he, Kerouac, would do it for him. The changeable chameleon mood of Kerouac came through vividly at this point. Following his remark on Joyce, he announced that he had finished his latest manuscript. Remember now, this was 1962. And that it would be forthcoming soon. He didn't wait for the question, but he loudly proclaimed its title, Visions of Gerard. Who's Gerard? The question came. The question was devastating. A twilight haze veiled Kerouac's face. But through the veil, we now could see a bewildered little boy striving to find his way out of the sudden darkness. Gerard is my brother, Kerouac said softly. He died when I was 9, when he was 9 and I was 4 at the time. I noted Kerouac's use of the verb is. Gerard is my brother. There was silence as the tape kept spinning on, and Curtis and I looked at each other, and I'm sure that we both felt that a wrong door had been opened. We were relieved, but only for a moment, when Kerouac resumed. He said in a halting, trembling voice, when he was on his deathbed, 9 nuns filed into his room and said, Gerard, repeat what you told us about heaven. Kerouac stopped, his jaw slackened. And as he continued, He said, Gerard told them, and he stopped again, a barely perceptible whimper escaping his lips. Once more silence fell on us, and I thought I could hear the tape mutely turning. I struggled for a transitional idea, and I said, that's a very beautiful thought, Jack. Very beautiful. He seemed to revive, though his voice remained subdued. He said, before he died, Gerard told my mother he was going to build her a beautiful white cottage in heaven. The word heaven trembled as Jack uttered it, and again his eyes betrayed a questioning flash of pain. Suddenly he bolted, regained his wind-blown, capricious, impetuous voice. He's the one that's doing all this, he said. And by this Kerouac meant, of course, his novels, written and to be written. Kerouac was Gerard, living on, writing, sucking up the wondrous wells of life. Gerard was not dead, he was alive. Kerouac was living proof of that. Well, we left Gerard and Kerouac's mystical reincarnation of him, plunged into a discussion of his beat literary buddies. Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, Corso. He praised them all. And he added the name of William S. Burroughs. He couldn't resist the term Rotten Burroughs. He called him a genius. He claimed credit for providing Burroughs with the title of his Naked Lunch. Then I mentioned this grandiose question about the inspirational sources that motivated Allen to write his best-known poem. Kerouac sort of giggled and he said, you know what motivated him? Ash cans and unobtainable dollars. That's what inspired him. Well, before the program ended, we steered Kerouac into the area of faith, God, belief. True, his words on Gerard had shed some light on this, and now he became more flippant than ever, though I'm convinced his remarks were seriously intended. He used to repeat this a number of times. I see God, he said, in a deistic way, in an agnostic way, in a Jesuitical way. I'm a Jesuit. And then his flippancy was dropped and he said, I live in a house with my mother. It's a monastery. I'm a monk and she's a reverend mother. Well, Kerouac left Lowell a few days later, and the ensuing years saw a correspondence between us. He was publishing more books. And then one day, I heard that Kerouac had married Stella Sampras, a Lowell native. He was planning to live in Lowell. And he came. And the first 3 of the last 4 years of his life, Jack was to spend in Lowell. Now, why he came back after years of travel, I'm still not sure. He gave me a number of reasons, all poetically vague. The one that I liked best was that he desired to re-enter the womb. It's the only place where nobody can get at you, he said. He said, look, you salt and pepper head old bastard. I'm asked to lecture at Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and other hallowed great seats of learning. Why should I bring my wondrous presence to Lowell Tech? I said, Jack, I said, this is your own, your native city. He laughed, made a face. Besides, I went on, Jack, I sign on the road to my classes every year. What could be more ideal than to have the author interpret this classic for them? So he feigned a suspicious look and he said, Jarvis, screw you. Screw you and your flattery. My book doesn't need anybody to interpret it. It speaks for itself. And so it does, Jack, I said, but think of the impact of your divine presence. And he said, yes. He drawled like W.C. Fields. He liked to do that. There is that to consider. Oh, wow. Boy, Jack got to everybody, right? Anyway, he didn't give me a definite answer about Lowell Tech, but I was hopeful. I saw Jack at his house about a week later, and he agreed to speak to my students. And we enthusiastically talked about it, and he cackled at the prospect, and he said, you know, Jarvis, I'll juice up your students, we'll all get drunk and become holy degenerates. Then I said, then I'll get fired, Jack, for corrupting the youth. And I'll be put on trial like Socrates was, then I'll have to drink the hemlock, and that'll be the end of that. He said, the only thing we're going to drink will be booze. That stuff will kill you too, he said, prophetically, but it takes longer. As we talk about his imminent Lowell Tech appearance, the idea came to me that possibly he could become a more permanent part of the college's academic activity. I said, Jack, how about applying for a writer-in-residence job? No, I said, I mean it. Here you are, an internationally famous writer, now living in your hometown. You could hold seminars and have the students huddled around your feet, classical style. He says, what do you mean huddled around my feet? What's the matter with them? Are they paralyzed or something? So, no, I says, they can sit up sideways any way you want them. So then he said, a writer in residence. That sounds wildly intellectual, Professor Jarvie. He used to egalicize my name occasionally. I said, all you have to do, Jack, is to give the word. I'll start the ball rolling. I think Lowell Tech would look very kindly on such a prospect. He said, I don't know, Jarvis. I think you're trying to suck me into something. And then assuming a pose of mock pride, he said, you know, I'm not a meatball professor. I'm a writer, he said. And the twain never shall meet unless it's in a steam bath. Well, we left it there, but 2 days later, I got a letter from Kerouac. All right, think about it. Go ahead. I'll wait. A couple of days later, I got a letter from Jack. And the letter was postmarked Lowell. And I thought it was strange that he should write when a telephone, you know, so handy. And the letter said, Dear Charlie. He used to call me Charlie. He said, no, I'm serious about the Lowell Tech writer-in-residence job. Go right ahead for the second semester, and if it's too late for that, let me know. As I say, I've had similar offers from other colleges around the country, but to these seminars I could walk over the Moody Street Bridge yet. And after the lecture, I can always brood under the bridge or even jump in the river, the Merrimack River. He said, I can line up the lectures, brochures, because the only experience I've had in teaching literature is teaching it to thousands of kids already informally. You can't learn how to write, but you can certainly learn why literature tells the truth of a given time. I've got my hair cut and eyes ready, he said. Yours affectionately, you old bastard, Jack Kerouac. You see, you like me a lot, really. Then he said, P.S., I can write formal business letters if need be and put in a phony eleemosynary initial as witness I.E., E.T.C., J.L.K., C.E.J. Who the hell is C.E.J.? He writes all this. Anyway, 3 days before Jack was to lecture to my students, I got a phone call from his wife, Stella. She said, Charles, I must ask you to release Jack from his promise to speak to your class. She was pleading. I knew something had gone wrong. I waited. She went on. She said, Jack has become very upset over this thing. He told me he can't go through with it. Don't ask me why, but he's almost in tears thinking about it. He's been drinking more than ever. I'm afraid he's going to get very sick. Well, of course, I was disappointed. Kerouac could not bring himself to speak to a group of students at Lowell Tech. Why? I remembered a recurring thought in some of his letters, crossing the Moody Street Bridge, which one has to do to reach Lowell Tech. Every time I cross the Moody Street Bridge, I feel a weight of guilt, he had written in one letter. In his letter about the writer-in-residence job, he said, to these seminars I could walk over the Moody Street Bridge, yet, and after the lecture I can always brood under the bridge or even jump in the river. The Moody Street Bridge spans the Merrimack River and is astride the area of Lowell in which Kerouac was born and raised. There's no doubt it was deeply interwoven with Jack's childhood fantasies. In Dr. Sachs, he writes, by moonlight night I see the mighty Merrimack foaming in 1,000 white horses upon the tragic plains below. Jay, of course, read part of that. Dream, wooden sidewalk planks of Moody Street Bridge fall out. I hover in beams over rages of white horses in the roaring low. Moaning onward, armies and cavalries of charging, you planters, you Dronicus, King Gray's looped, and curly like artists work, and with clay soles, snow, curlicue, rooster, togas in the forefront. I had a terror of those waves, those rocks, Well, thinking about his wife Stella's urgent importunings to me, I wondered if Kerouac had developed a terror of speaking at Lowell Tech, going before his hometown, stripping himself spiritually naked for all of his fellow townsmen to see. He talked about brooding under the bridge or even jumping in the river. If Jack were committing slow suicide by his ceaseless, tragic drinking, maybe he was afraid of speeding up the process, crossing the Moody Street Bridge. The last years of Jack's residency in Lowell saw two more of his novels published, Satori in Paris, Vanity of Douloise. The first was a thin volume which Kerouac himself characterized as a sentimental genealogical journey. It evolved out of a trip that he made to France some years earlier. I went to Brittany and I went to Normandy, he said expansively, and though I'm not descended from kings, my blood was at the first crusade. I said, you gotta be kidding, Jack. Then he snickered. He says, man, every time I see a Saracen, my blood begins to boil. Well, Satori in Paris was generally praised by reviewers, but generally ignored by the readers. Same fate was experienced by Vanity of Douloise. And thus the years of arid reader appeal since On the Road mounted. If Kerouac were deeply disturbed by this decline, he never directly expressed it, at least in my presence. One is tempted to divide Jack's works into two broad categories: his Lowell novels and his beat novels. On the Road, The Dharma Bums, Desolation Angels, Big Sur, The Subterraneans, Visions of Cody, these books scream out Kerouac's ecstasy of search. In this search, he created a new language, a kind of onomatopoetic glossary of pain, an ESP set to words. These novels are really long essays that try to record, without benefit of musical instruments, the true cadence of life. Whether or not a reader of these novels thinks they do is almost irrelevant. Because what is relevant is that Jack offers to those who dare to look some explosive flashes of life's terror. It's true, a character like Dean Moriarty comes through much of the time as a no-good bastard, maybe, an animal whose only concern is drinking, goofballing, and sleeping with women. Man still regards these activities as a dear portion of his waking moments. Now, if Kerouac's beat psyche reflects volcanic desperation, well, how different really is it from Thoreau and his quiet desperation? They both sweat, but in varying degrees. Kerouac's Lowell novels may be regarded as the other half of his spiritual schizophrenia. Here he is the romanticist. His characters are seen silhouetted against the twilight sky. They move about with a rugged, honest innocence, and Kerouac seems to weep for them because death will sweep them all away. French, Greeks, Irish, Portuguese, Poles, these are the late immigrants and the sons of immigrants that populate Kerouac's Lowell. If they were crude, hard-working people, Kerouac ennobled them because they were not afraid of life. And yet, in books like Maggie Cassidy and Dr. Sachs, there is a melancholy background theme suggestive of futility and death. Jack Kerouac was a man at war with himself. If his beat novels shriek for the desire to burn, 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 his Lowell novels lament a lost innocence, an unfulfilled grace. Despite his monumental travels in the world of the id, with side journeys into Zen Buddhism and other credos, Kerouac in the end professed the belief of his childhood saints. In the final analysis, however, it must be said that the two-type Kerouac novel concept must live precariously. His first published novel, The Town and the City, the last one he wrote, Vanity of Douloise, are deep-throated fugues that sing of a rare figurine, a satyr, one might say, in which the beat artist and the wide-eyed youth were inextricably sculptured together. There was always about Jack Kerouac, amid the wild flood of words, an unmistakable beat, a rhythm of gentility, a hint of caution, a soft recurring note of concern. Jack Kerouac died in the month of October, autumn's most beloved. I think he always lived in an autumn dream, watching the tree leaves take sad flight. I think it's very fitting to end this with a quotation from On the Road, where in the middle of an avalanche of existence, he comes to a screeching halt and he writes, And for just a moment of time, I had reached the point of ecstasy that I always wanted to reach, which was the complete step across chronological time into timeless shadows and wonderment in the bleakness of the mortal realm and the sensation of death kicking at my heels to move on, with a phantom dogging its own heels and myself hurrying to a plank where all the angels dove off and flew into the holy void of uncreated emptiness, the potent and inconceivable radiancies shining in bright mind essence, innumerable lotus lands falling open in the magic moth swarm of heaven. I could hear an indescribable seething roar which wasn't in my ear, but everywhere, and had nothing to do with death, with sounds. I realized that I had died and been reborn numberless times, but just didn't remember especially because the transitions from life to death and back to life were so ghostly easy, a magical action for naught, like falling asleep and waking up a million times, the utter casualness and deep ignorance of it. I realized it was only because of the stability of the intrinsic mind that these ripples of birth and death took place, like the action of wind on a sheet of pure, serene, mirror-like water. I felt sweet, swinging bliss, like a big shot of heroin in the mainline vein, like a gulp of wine late in the afternoon, and it makes you shudder. My feet tingle. I thought I was going to die the very next moment. Enough said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jarvis. Belongs to the people now. The academicians are going to sit down and relax. Thank you. Would anyone like to raise a question at this particular time, or would someone on the panel like to respond to what's been said?
Yeah, I'd like a shot at it. When he mentioned in the 50s about Eisenhower, what was happening then, something else was happening. On this panel, you don't see any female. But female was in it at that time, and I'll lay it on to you. They were put into places when they were changing, like the men were. They were put into $50 a day at that time into places like Stowbridge, headshots. The family thought if they're paying $50 a day, their kids would be all right. They didn't want the 2 cars anymore. They didn't want to marry. The girls start reading Rimbaud. They start loving life and beauty. And they got fucked. Really. They were the victims of the beats. See, the men were tough babies. They took it and they got out of it, and they're the poets today. That's the shot. That's a truie. It's a goodie, too. You agree, Mr. Jarvis? Professore. Chuck. All right, Charlie, you agree? Oh, last night I saw on Salem TV, a man in the aeroplane, it was 1 o'clock, man in the aeroplane, says, wow, amazing to meet you here, Charlie Chan. On an aeroplane in 1939. Yeah, well, the females, you see, Hope, my first girlfriend, what a name, Hope. And her last name's Savage, right. Hope Savage, right. This girl, when she was 15 years old, read Rimbaud, the Marquis, the Maquis, the Sade. The whole shot, man, what's that? No, 1947. But the females, and she wrote beautiful poetry at 9 years old. They sent her to a place where you get, your shock treatment. What a sad shot. Well, that's America for you. They did that, and they have your $50 a day numbers in those days, in the 50s. And the man who was vice president then is now president now, right? It's full circle, is it, gentlemen?
Okay. May I perhaps try to bring Aaron Latham in on this?
Well, why does he move it himself? Yeah, you think I'm an interrupter or something? I mean, like, what do you guys got to say anyway? Hey, Al, what do you got to say, Al? Lay it on that.
I'm sort of curious. Aaron Latham's working on a biography, and I'd like you to respond, if you would, briefly, Aaron, on the Charters biography and how you think yours might be different or what you might try to develop in it.
I got it.
Well, I haven't read the Charters biography. I think it is. I haven't read the Charters biography just because I thought I'd want to finish mine first before I just wanted to get the shape of my book down before I started in reading hers. The main thing that I've had is the main difference is going to be that I have letters that Kerouac wrote, and the cooperation of the estate and the agent, along with. I guess one thing that I know just from reading reviews that she talks about is how On the Road came to be written, and supposedly the myth is that Jack Kerouac wrote On the Road in 3 weeks. He got this continuous roll of paper, put it in the typewriter, and wrote On the Road in 3 weeks. And I'm told that in her book she debunks this. Yet another myth shot down, like Paul Revere didn't really ride to spread the alarm. All these myths go. Jack Kerouac didn't really ride On the Road in 3 weeks. One of the things that I did find out, went back and looked at John Holmes' journals, went back and got the original manuscript of On the Road, and it turns out the myth is actually true. He really did ride On the Road, not in 3 weeks, but actually in 20 days. There was one of his friends, a guy named Canastra, had been an artist.
Bill Canastra, right.
Had been an artist, and he had an apartment down near the village. He was a
lawyer. He was a lawyer, actually, but he had a loft on 21st Street and 7th Avenue.
And he
Sometimes worked in the paper.
At any rate, he happened to get on a subway one day, and he was going someplace out in the Bronx or wherever, and suddenly he decided he'd like to get off the subway and have a drink at a bar that he remembered nearby.
Right,
And he got about halfway off the subway when it started out,
He went out.
and
And that's when I came in on the scene. Right, Alan?
Yeah.
When Canasta went out, I came in.
at any rate,
That dumb fucker put his head in a moving train.
Yes.
Out the window. Flash, flash. Out.
So at any rate, that was the end of Bill.
What do you mean quiet? It's the truth.
That was the end of Bill Canastra trying to get off the subway when it was moving. He hits the end of the line, and he was killed. So Canastra, his apartment was taken over by one of his girlfriends, and Jack Kerouac went around one day to see the girlfriend.
Smells like
Actually went around
pipe,
because he
too.
thought there was a party at Canastra's, and it turns out there's no party, but there's this girl there. So pretty soon, Canastra marries a girl named Joan Alley, and moves into that apartment. And what should he find there but Chinese art paper, 20 feet long strips of Chinese art paper. So he took the strips and pasted them all together into a strip that was 120 feet long, and rolled it into his typewriter and started writing On the Road. I mean, just the weird way things happen in this man's life. If Canastra hadn't decided to get off the subway, he wouldn't have been killed. The girlfriend wouldn't have had the apartment. Kerouac would not have found the Chinese art paper, and American literature would have been different.
Let's keep this factual. Alan, when did he get the roll of paper? I thought he got it from UPI.
My understanding was that he got a roll of teletype paper, quote-unquote teletype, from,
UPI.
from Lucian Carr,
UPI.
who was at that time living, I think,
That's the truth.
with me.
You better, if you're going to
Next
write a
door.
biography, baby, get it
Wait a
straight.
minute. Next door, and used one of Lucian's teletype rolls, I think.
And Jarvis,
But I mean, I
don't you
wouldn't-
tell me to shut up again. You did.
Oh,
man.
take it easy.
Well,
Wait.
He's sensitive.
actually, it's,
Said it in Greek too, you know.
I mean, it's in Kerouac's letters that he
That
used
he used the
art
Chinese
paper.
paper?
It's true that all his later books, once he discovered this technique
He used-
of using a continuous roll of paper, he knew Lucian Carr, who was still at UPI, and Lucian Carr gave him teletype paper on which he wrote Big Sur, Maggie Cassidy, all the later books. But at any rate,
The original one was in Chinese art paper pasted together.
right, and it's in fact it's intact in Sterling Lord's safe.
Uh-huh.
And
Well,
there's-
you know, he gave me a roll, Mexican City Blues on roll, his beautiful poetry, Al,
Yeah.
and I sold that to buy dope. Beautiful. See, he's in those safe, it's gone. Man, I just shot it in my arms beautifully. And Jack cried. Jack, oh good God, Gregory's taking dope.
Oh, there's a couple. They do.
You fucking lush.
Nobody can hear.
Why don't you,
That was true.
Speak into
Okay.
that.
I don't,
I saw that teletype roll when he was
working.
typing on it. He moved to 21st Street,
Right.
or moved over to the west side, to a street which was later occupied by Leroy Jones. Maybe 7 years later, 8 years later, 60, 61, 59, 60, 61. It was a one-room apartment that he lived in.
Right.
Bed in the middle of the room, kitchenette.
21st Street, I think.
Yeah, and a screen, a sort of one of those,
The screen covering
the area where he worked, I
he
think.
works right in the middle of the room.
Yeah.
Uh,
But I thought it was a
it's about
teletype roll.
20 feet from the window, so he can
Yeah.
unroll
Yeah.
enough to tell himself.
Hey,
where he-
Jarvis, you know when you talk about masturbation with Kerouac, he hit the high-class shot, but he got it unnaturally. I got it in the natural way because I was in prison, and you have to jerk off in prison, you see? But it's the best masturbation.
doesn't it get boring, Gregory?
It's not boring at all, masturbation. It's beautiful. You come all over yourself when you come. What are you talking about?
Well, you've got to be a poet, right?
What?
You've got to be imaginative, creative, is that it?
No way. You got to think in your head what you're coming for, yeah.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
Can I ask,
Jack's fantasy was black panties.
Aaron, did you want to conclude? Or,
Well, the
You know what mine was, Alan, jerking off by?
Gregory.
Women bending down for their baby carriages. Oh, God. Can you imagine? I get my dick erected like that.
They're okay. That's,
Aaron?
well, anyway, the point of the story is that the role still exists, and
Yeah.
at any rate, and you going back over it, you find that actually very little of it was ever changed. I mean, it went right, it was published almost exactly as he wrote it in that 20 days. His editor at the Viking Press made him cut some of it because...
You ever jerk off, Eric?
No, let him finish. Come on.
I whenever you ever jerked off.
Let him finish, Gregory, please.
Well, finish jerking off.
Anyway, the point of the story was that this great myth is true. I mean, he did write it in 20 days,
yeah.
and it was a whole new beginning for his way of writing, and really for a lot of people's.
His speech then was that he could type athletically 120 words a minute at best, so he was able to transcribe instantaneously all the flash thoughts that went through his head and continue with one
Alan,
single
Without
stream.
misspelling.
Alan, may I ask you something?
Oh,
Excuse me.
sure.
You know, didn't he write some of these, weren't they some of these handwritten manuscripts?
Pardon me?
Handwritten manuscripts.
Well, he has lots of those. With
There are a lot of those, right?
He wrote
yeah,
Dr.
with a very
Sax's
athletic
hand.
hand also.
Why did that man seem like he came through life to check it out?
Why did he what?
He seemed like he came through to write it all down. You know, when I left prison, the old mafia man, the big man there, finally spoke to me when I left, and he said, Gregory, if you see 3 people, make sure you see 4. In other words, dig yourself. Always keep in control. That man must have gone through life always digging himself and being in control. But his drinking, I saw today with the film and the tape, always in control. That's a little spooky. I went there and, what about participation?
Control.
Yeah, all the way. He must have been in control all the way, and that's spooky.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I fuck up a lot. He don't seem to fuck up, that man, except his death of drinking. Wow. I mean, you all got to go, gentlemen.
No, he sort of goofed.
Well, that's the
quite a bit,
truth,
too.
man. Well, he seemed like he was recording
Like the
shot.
Buckley show, he felt, or others.
You think I would have met Mr. Kerouac if I never met you, Al?
Pardon me?
Would I have met Johnny Kerouac if I had never met you?
Probably, yeah, because he was hanging around the village same time you were, actually.
I was born there, Al. I was
Well,
hanging
so-
around. You guys came down there, you fuckers.
Well, yeah, but he gave birth to the village for that generation.
You want to hear a great thing about Kerouac that nobody knows. And this is what he wrote in The Subterraneans, which he put in San Francisco, but actually happened in New York. In the San Remo bar. The hipsters, Mason Hoppenberg, who worked on Candy with Terry Southern, Anton Rosenberg, with a beautiful face, me, sitting at that table, and Bill Keck. Jack is talking, and one of the hipsters says to the other hipster, dig that aggression. Because he was talking. Yeah, man. They never talk anything. I was like, those guys didn't say a word, man. And remember, Jack was talking to me to dig that aggression. So he was hot and they were cool, and the hot made it.
Yeah, there was a great deal of resentment against him, both from subterranean, very cool, tense, later junkie hipsters, as well as from very cold academic hard hearts. It was against his enthusiasm, which in an essay called The Origins of the Beat Generation, he describes in lively presentation, the realization that in America there is a Dostoevskian, enthusiastic, nutty, friendly tendency, people rushing up to confront each other's souls.
Imagine going up to your mother and say, "Hi, Ma," and she says, "Dig that aggression." Oh my God, your wife or somebody you love, like, "Hi, dig that aggression."
But as part of that enthusiasm, the last passage you read was from what? From On the Road. Yeah. So what was coming? What was being presented there was a vision of life in which we here in the room are still all sitting. A permanent vision, a permanent way of looking at ourselves and each other. Because in a sense, this room is an extension of one of Kerouac's novels, in which I think everybody here who appreciates Kerouac sees himself as another personage in the novel of the universe, another strange angel sitting in the eternal place, discussing an archangel who proclaimed the eternality of our presence together. Which is the curious thing about this symposium, I think, in a sense, more open-hearted than most academic symposiums could be, because the subject was one who proclaimed open heart and consciousness of one's own divine presence in the place
Jack Kerouac is a
where we
big
are.
creep, Alan. You know that. He's a big creep, man.
Let me
It's
continue.
true. He was a creep,
Gregory,
man.
Gregory,
could you
now
let
be
him finish,
quiet,
please?
Why
I'm
not say he
older
was a
because I'm
creep?
older
Why
than you.
not?
Because
You
I'm
see
older.
how they get uptight, man? You
Come on.
see what I'm
Just
doing?
let him finish,
Come on,
Gregory. Let him finish.
Please. Don't interrupt my poetry.
But when I interrupt, I go fast.